Most about protect yourself for a long time. Touch go.
Announced yesterday that both Daniel Dubois and Joyce will be participating in separate interim bouts ahead of their fight with each other later on this year. This is a prelude to the big mega matchup between Daniel Dubois and Joyce, provided they make it through these fights, though all things considered, given who their opponents are and where their opponents are in their careers, it's a safe bet that both Joe and Daniel will make it through this prelude, these interim fights. Tune-up fights, essentially. Fights that allow both the fighters to shake off the cobwebs, the ring rust, ahead of their fight with each other. And it's the funniest thing, because I vaguely recall such a proposition being made for both Vasyl Lomachenko and Teofimo Lopez. And there were those out there who tried to use said proposition as a means to levy criticism towards Vasyl Lomachenko.
You don't remember that?
You don't remember how Teofimo Lopez, his side of things, was running around telling people that Vasyl Lomachenko's people wanted a tune-up fight ahead of their fight with each other. And that was never confirmed. I mean,
it wasn't.
Here today, I've yet to have seen a video from Vasyl Lomachenko or Aegis Klimas, who manages him, stating that they wanted to get in an interim fight before they fight Lopez. To my knowledge, that suggestion didn't necessarily come from the Vasyl Lomachenko Aegis Klimas side of things. It came from the top-ranked side of things, who promotes both. The both of them.
Yeah.
You want my opinion, and you're here, so I'll assume that you do. I'm of the opinion that that suggestion wasn't coming from Vasyl Lomachenko or Aegis Klimas. It was coming from Top Rank, who wanted to be able to keep the fighters busy and get them back out there one more time.
They fight each other.
Because they knew the pandemic was raging. They couldn't stage a big fight like Vasyl Lomachenko and Teofimo Lopez just yet. The situation with the COVID-19 virus was still evolving. They weren't sure when they'd be able to stage that fight. So in the in-between time, they wanted to get these guys out there. That's where I think that suggestion came from, and that's why I think that suggestion was made, though it's neither here nor there, as those two guys are going to fight each other straight away. But that suggestion got people talking. That suggestion, in spite of not being confirmed by the Vasyl Lomachenko side of things, was used as ammunition to criticize Vasyl Lomachenko, to accuse him of ducking. That suggestion, that kind of a situation, is what we're seeing here with Joe and Daniel. And neither one of these two guys are ducking each other. They're still slated to fight.
Yeah.
And that just goes to show how desperate some people are to attack a fighter, vilify a fighter, for no reason other than they don't like them. Might not be any actual precedence for the individual to have so many harsh criticisms towards the fighter, but because they already have a bias against that fighter, they will doctor up whatever criticisms they can. They will use whatever they can use to soil that fighter's name, even when there's no actual precedence to do so. There's no reason to be so fucking critical. But that's how things work here in the YouTube boxing community. And hey, those guys are entitled to their opinions. They are. They're entitled to like whoever they like and not like whoever they don't like.
They are.
But the why is what's important. The why is where integrity is either established or unestablished, compromised even, as an irrational, inexplicable bias against a particular fighter. A bias that really can't be characterized, a bias that can't be explained logically, quantified.
Yeah.
Actual reasoning skills. That kind of bias denotes a lack of basic integrity and a lack of basic intelligence. It's only an irrational, emotional individual operates in this fashion. But I've spent far too much time on that. Back to Joe, back to Daniel, their interim fights, their tune-up fights ahead of their fight with each other. We're going to be seeing Joyce fight. We're going to be seeing him return to action later on this month, towards the end, on the 25th, against Michael Walisch, who hails out of Germany, has a professional record of 20 wins, 3 losses, 13 knockouts. Michael is a lot more experienced guy than the guy that Daniel Dubois is going to be fighting in Pfeiffer. I think it's safe to say that when you cross-examine their careers so far. But make no mistake, Walisch is a tune-up kind of guy, keep busy kind of guy, shaking off the cobwebs kind of guy. That's what he is. What notariable names you can find on Michael's resume are guys who beat him. That's essentially saying that every single time he stepped up in competition, not only did he lose, but he was stopped in the process of losing. He was stopped in 5 by journeyman Christian Hammer, stopped in 2 by prospect F.A. Ajagba, and stopped in 3 by yet another prospect in Tony Yoka. All of these losses happened within Michael Walisch's last 6 fights. Here today, he's literally coming off of that loss to Tony Yoka. So you can understand why the people over there at Queensbury, Old Fish Eyes, decided that Joyce keep busy with this kind of guy. He doesn't want to put him in there with someone that would jeopardize the Daniel Dubois mega fight. You want to keep Joe busy, but you don't want to keep him so busy that it fucks up that Dubois fight.
And I'm okay with that.
And I'm okay with that because the Daniel Dubois fight is a done deal. This is just a prelude. I'm okay with that because these are also extenuating circumstances. Had it not been for the COVID-19 pandemic, there wouldn't need to be any alterations to the plan. There wouldn't have been any need for a keep busy fight ahead of Joyce versus Daniel Dubois. But you know, things happen and you have to roll with the punches. Joyce is actually in need of a keep busy fight, a shaking off the cobwebs fight. This guy hasn't been in action since July of last year. The night of the fight, it will have been a year's time since Joyce fought anybody under the hot lights. These really aren't ideal conditions for a guy like Joe, who's approaching his mid-30s, to have gone straight into the Daniel Dubois fight because it would have been over a year's time since the guy had a fight. You don't want any excuses if Daniel Dubois emerges the victor. You don't want to hear about how I was inactive and I had ring rust I could have done with a tune-up fight. No, we're taking care of that.
There's your tune-up.
No excuses. You'll get your chance to shake off the ring rust. You'll get your chance to shake off those cobwebs and get your juices going so that you're fully prepared to lock horns with Daniel Dubois towards the end of the year. And I am expecting Joe to make it through this. I am expecting him to make it through this because he's fighting a guy who's lost 3 times and was stopped all 3 times. Joe, he's a slow guy, but he's also a heavy-handed guy and a volume guy. So I fully expect Joyce to make it through this Mike Walisch fight. Now, as far as Daniel, we're going to be seeing him return to action later on next month, in August, towards the end of the month, against Eric Pheifer, a guy who's even less experienced than Joe's opponent, Michael, albeit unbeaten. Eric Pfeiffer sports a professional record of 7 wins, 5 knockouts, but as you can imagine, we're talking about 7 wins and 5 knockouts over domestic level, pedestrian level competition. Eric is unbeaten as a professional. He's making his bones, attempting to climb up the ranks, and should Daniel Dubois give him his first professional loss, that will be the 5th unbeaten fighter that Daniel Dubois has beaten. It kind of reminds me of what Anthony Joshua's resume looked like when he was climbing up the ranks. You know, Anthony Joshua, he gave 3 guys their first professional losses before he even became a champion. Emmanuel Leo, Gary Cornish, Dylan White. Then, subsequently, Charles Martin, the IBF champion, who was also undefeated at the time. And after that, Dominic Brazil, who also was undefeated at that time. The last undefeated fighter Anthony Joshua gave their first professional loss to was Joseph Parker, the then WBO champion. Makes for a grand total of 6 unbeaten fighters. Anthony Joshua unseated en route to becoming one of the upper echelon fighters in the heavyweight division, and it looks a lot like Daniel Dubois is following in those footsteps. As for Daniel, this could be the 5th unbeaten fighter Daniel Dubois dishes out first professional loss to. And in all likelihood, he will Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Both Daniel and Eric, they might both be undefeated fighters climbing up the ranks, looking to make a name for themselves. But make no mistake, these two guys, they ain't on the same level.
No, I don't think they are.
People over there at Queensbury Promotions, Frank Warren, old Fish Eyes, they didn't decide to let Daniel fight this Pfeiffer guy because of how fucking great Pfeiffer looks, or how great Pfeiffer is doing. You know, they picked this guy because it's a safe choice.
What it is.
Call him preparation, call him a prelude, call him a pushover. Call him what you will. But if the people at Queensbury approve this fight, I'll tell you what, it ain't because of how fucking dangerous Pfeiffer is. Now, Daniel, he hasn't been out of action quite as long as Joyce has. You know, Joe last had a fight in July of last year, whereas Daniel, he was last in action towards the end, in December. But you know, Daniel needs a tune-up too. I mean, that's the last time you had a fight. Why not squeeze one in there, get the juices going, before you go in there and try to take Joyce's head off? I don't see why not. Now, we'll be giving both Michael Walisch and Eric Pfeiffer an even closer look as the fight dates for these fights approach at the end of this month and the following month towards the end of August. But for now, keep your eyes peeled for Joyce versus Walisch and Dubois versus
Pfeiffer.
Moving on. You know, there's been a lot of talk of Vasyl Lomachenko and Teofimo Lopez as of late, since the fight itself was postponed from September into October, and that brings certain hot topics
To mind.
to discussion.
What a fight.
You know, what happens if Teofimo Lopez silences the critics, silences the naysayers? What happens if Teofimo Lopez pulls this off? Where would he be ranked on your pound-for-pound list? Where should he? Well, we here at The Relay, we keep a pound-for-pound list of our own. I'm sure you're familiar with it, and if you're not,
Here we go.
this is how the cookie would crumble, could crumble, if Teofimo Lopez pulls off this miracle. I want to say that Teofimo Lopez does stand a chance of winning this fight, as it will have been a year's time, over a year I think, since Vasyl Lomachenko has had a fight the night of the fight with Teofimo. Ring rust, it is a factor. So it's not like Teofimo's up the creek without a paddle here. Don't confuse him with Anthony Crolla. One thing you want to be mindful of is that Vasyl Lomachenko hasn't been in action since August of last year, and he's not set to return to the ring tentatively until October of this year. So that's over a year right then and there for what is a very nuanced, athletic, yet aging fighter. And Vasyl Lomachenko, don't write off Teofimo Lopez completely. If Teofimo were to pull off
This upset.
this miracle, this upset, he would be the unified lightweight champion in possession of 3 of the 4 major titles in the lightweight division.
And the ring bell.
Vasyl Lomachenko would be the second active reigning world champion he would have beaten in what is his short career. Sensational stuff, no doubt about it. And it takes sensational stuff to be integrated into the Ring IQ pound-for-pound list. The question is, where? What spot should Teofimo Lopez occupy if he pulls off this miracle? To fully understand how this list works, one must realize that this list quantifies a fighter's entire career and cross-compares that fighter's accomplishments with the accomplishments of all others ranked on the list. More accomplishments a fighter tallies, the higher on the list he climbs. Currently, Vasyl Lomachenko ranks in the number 6 spot behind Naoya Inoue, Terrence Crawford, Chocolatito, Canelo Alvarez, and Manny Pacquiao, who sits in the number 1 spot as he is the most accomplished active fighter in the sport of boxing today. And, more importantly, he is a reigning active world champion, which is a requisite to even be considered for a spot on this list, much less ranked. And per the rules and governing criteria that this list is based upon, in defeating a pound-for-pound fighter, Teofimo Lopez becomes one himself. That doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to occupy the same spot as Vasyl Lomachenko. That's basically saying that you might have bumped Vasyl Lomachenko off this list. Vasyl Lomachenko, who sits at number 6 right now. But that doesn't mean that you're going to sit at number 6 yourself ahead of all those other guys, because those other guys are actually more accomplished than you are, even if you beat Vasyl Lomachenko. That's right, and it's looking a lot like, if Vasyl Lomachenko loses to Teofimo Lopez in October, some of those ranked behind Vasyl Lomachenko here today would advance at least 1 spot. Teofimo might land somewhere in the number 9, perhaps even number 8, ahead of Juan Francisco Estrada. You've got to quantify, count these fighters' accomplishments based on the governing criteria of this list to understand the pecking order. You know, Kosei Tanaka, very accomplished guy, and so few pro fights, I might add. You know, this guy's a 3-division champion already. But in spite of being a 3-division champion, he's only actually ever beaten one active reigning world champion. The other belts that he won were vacant. It wasn't until he fought Sho Kimura for the WBO title at flyweight that he unseated an active reigning world champion. I mean, he's still very accomplished. He's a 3-division champion in only 12 professional fights. No losses.
He stands a very good chance
Of becoming the fastest 4-division champion in the history of boxing. Kosei Tanaka's resume ain't nothing to sneeze at, but better still. If Teofimo beats Vasyl Lomachenko, becomes the unified Ring Magazine and lineal champion in the lightweight division, at minimum, Teofimo would be ranked ahead of Kosei.
at least for the time being.
It's because, while Kosei may have been a world champion in more weight classes than Teofimo Lopez, he wouldn't have beaten as many active reigning champions as Teofimo, and unlike Teofimo, Kosei's never been unified. In this scenario, Teofimo would be, and not only would he be unified, he'd be the Ring Magazine and lineal champion of his weight class. And until such a time as Kosei were to either defeat the same number of world champions that Teofimo has, or unify the same number of world titles that Teofimo has, there wouldn't be a logical precedence based on the governing criteria to rank Kosei ahead of
Lopez.
Teofimo. Now with Juan Francisco Estrada, it is a little different. You see, hypothetically speaking, if Teofimo Lopez beats Vasyl Lomachenko in October, that would be the second active reigning world champion he has unseated. But that doesn't put him ahead of Juan Francisco Estrada. Juan Francisco Estrada himself has beaten 2 active reigning world champions. He defeated the unified champion Brian Valoria in the flyweight division for what were the WBA and WBO titles. So later, Juan moved up to the super flyweight division, and in his rematch with Sorun Visai, he effectively became the WBC's super flyweight champion. So not only would Juan Francisco Estrada have already beaten the same number of world champions as Teofimo, but he would have been a champion in more weight classes than Teofimo. Thus, ranking Teofimo ahead of Juan is subject to some debate, some contention. I think that the fashion of Teofimo Lopez's victory would help to strengthen his argument, so that perhaps he could land ahead of Juan Francisco Estrada, but right now, it is clear that Juan's more accomplished than he is, even in that scenario, even if it's not by much. And the higher on the list you climb, the more you realize its structure, its governing criteria, that those ranked ahead of Juan have either been champions in more weight classes than Juan, and or beaten more world champions than Juan. Obviously, Teofimo Lopez. Because the climb to the upper echelon ranked standings of this list, the upper tier, it's not a catapult. It very much is a climb, and it takes an accumulated effort, great one, throughout a fighter's career to achieve that top 5, top 3, and ultimately that number 1 status.